There are some global pressure groups, I'm talking about Zionism, that decide international policies. We're seeing it with Trump. Trump certainly did not want to enter this war, nor did the United States. It has been dragged in by the power of its Zionist pressure groups, in this case from Israel. Women do not face any kind of oppression in Iran. When I say no kind of oppression, I mean no kind of oppression. There is nothing that justifies us saying that women are oppressed.
Why is it bad for that greater Israel to be created, when Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East?
I start from the premise that Israel is an illegitimate, illegal country that has used terrorism and that there is no justification for its existence. Since 1948, when it was established, it has been the embodiment of illegality in the form of a state. Because Israel is a mono-religious state, it is an ethno-religious state, and it would put an end to the existence of the Middle East. And for the suppression of the existence of the Middle East, it involves annihilation or expulsion. Everyone who is not Jewish.
Is Islam the enemy of the West?
The enemy of Europe is actually the one who makes us believe that Islam is the enemy. Saying that Islam is the enemy is an idea that underlies those narratives, which is promoted by those major Zionist lobbies that try to make us see things that way. Among other things, it's also to justify to us the systematic attack on that part of the world.
I'm trying to destroy it, but it's tough since I'm making enemies. I recently posted a story and lost many followers.
Because I said today you'll lose more. Goodbye.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of LA Factoria. Today we have the great pleasure of having Carlos Paz, a historian specializing in Islam, a very controversial figure, and as we were saying off camera, with a strong commitment to the truth. And the truth takes no prisoners and is often not well received, generally speaking. How are you, Carlos? How are you doing? It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I didn't hesitate to come when you called, of course, and I think this show is going to be just that, a commitment to the truth. That's what we're here for, so let's see what comes out of it.
First of all, before getting into the current conflicts, the past conflicts, before doing an in-depth analysis of all the problems it faces, not exclusively the Middle East, because that extends to problems all over the globe. What got you interested? How did you reach this level of expertise in this whole conflict?
Well, after all, because I started analyzing Middle Eastern issues from the very beginning, since my youth, I studied Arabic philology, and the revolution overwhelmed me. I'm already over 50 years old. I'm getting closer to 60 than to 50. My first memory is the Islamic Revolution, how it surprised the world. That part of the world attracted me. I became interested in Saddam Hussein's Iraq when I was just 20 years old, but above all, the spark that drew me into analyzing the Middle East is the war in Syria. In 2011, we started getting news about what was happening there. I realized that things weren't being told to us truthfully, so I went to Syria. And saw what the Middle East is like: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine. I had already traveled to Turkey before, but for other reasons, and I fell in love with that part of the world. You find that it's a part of the world that's not at all like we've been told, and it's actually very similar to what Spain was like in the 1980s. There isn't that political correctness that oppresses and suffocates us. And little by little, as you start to realize it, your specialization in the area has led it to become the leitmotif of your life. Religion, Islam, the language, Arabic, Mediterranean culture, that's a part we share with them, that cultural background. And when you realize it, it's been Iran, it's been the United Arab Emirates, it's been a series of countries that make the center of your life the Middle East and clarifying what's happening there.
Okay, I want to ask you a question. You've fallen in love with the culture. You've even studied the origins of Islam, but you're Catholic, right?
I am Christian.
Not Catholic.
I am baptized. Culturally, I am Catholic. We Spaniards are culturally Catholic. It's something that can't be separated from our nature. But the symbiosis with that part of the world is so strong that after getting to know the original Christian communities of Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, I actually feel closer to them. Maybe to the way of thinking, which are, well, purely theological differences, right? about what happens after death, the final judgment, that kind of thing, but I almost feel more at home. With the Syriac Orthodox Church, which is the church that St. Peter founded after the one in Jerusalem, it's the one that forms the Church of Antioch, and would those be theological discussions? I have no problem saying that I'm Catholic, but my approach to the original Christian churches nowadays, I feel closer to them than to Catholicism itself.
Carlos, nowadays the whole world is facing a rather complex situation. The first thing I want to discuss with you, then we can go on to analyze Saddam Hussein's Iraq, then we can analyze Libya, Gaddafi. What do they have in common? I want the program to be as extensive as possible since there are so many topics to cover. But today we are experiencing a very serious problem in the Strait of Hormuz, a very serious problem with the drive for dollar dominance. I want you to give me a brief analysis of the situation between Israel and the Middle East from your point of view.
After all, you're asking me why this war is happening. We have to start from the fact that when the Islamic Republic was established, after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran became part of the axis of evil, which is what George Bush later called the axis of evil. All the world's evils are embodied in Iran. But there is an explanation for this. To explain why what is happening, it's because in Iran, since that moment, something had happened a few decades earlier. But I'm not going to go back to the 1950s when Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, under the first Shah Pahlavi in 1953, nationalized the resources. At that time, an operation was created by British intelligence services, MI6, the CIA, and American and Israeli intelligence services to depose him. And for the second Shah, Reza Pahlavi, to return. The issue was the nationalization of resources. Why? Because the West cannot tolerate any country in the world, especially in the region we're talking about, having sovereignty over its resources. That is the final argument we must turn to in order to explain why this situation is happening. Iran has nationalized its resources, and that is not tolerable in the eyes of the West. That's why sanctions were imposed from the start, and it was subjected to an imposed war, the Iran-Iraq War. From 1980 to 1988, Islamist terrorist groups were used, such as the People's Mujahideen of Iran. Targeted assassinations were carried out, and a series of arguments were made that there is no democracy, that human rights are not respected, the situation of homosexuals, of women, even of Christians, to make us believe that it is a theocracy, an unsustainable dictatorship that massacres its own people. And what lies behind it is the destruction of the structures of the Iranian state, because it has nationalized resources. We have seen this in Gaddafi's Libya, in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, in Bashar al-Assad's Syria. All these countries had in common, like Nasser's Egypt, that they had nationalized resources. And all these countries are going to be systematically demonized so that the West can go there and extract wealth from their resources. This is the ultimate explanation. Many other factors are involved, including possible religious tensions. We could talk about the maintenance of Iran, the axis of resistance, about a whole series of countries and movements that were created as a result of the Islamic Revolution to attack and destroy Israel. But all of this is overlooked if we are very clear that the ultimate goal the West has for Iran is the destruction of the state's structures in order to replace them, whether the regime is that of the Shah or anyone else, so that the West can profit from its resources. This is the ultimate explanation.
I want to ask a question and go back so people understand. I don't have much knowledge about this, and that's why I love talking to people who have much more experience and knowledge in all these topics. And I wanted to ask you, nowadays there's a big campaign on social media where we're told that Persia, before it became Iran, before the Islamic Revolution, was a country that enjoyed freedom, a country where women dressed however they wanted. And that's quite convincing in the eyes of the public. How do you analyze it? The regime that existed before the Islamic Revolution. And do you think the Islamic Revolution was positive or negative for Iran?
Well, first of all, let me clarify that it wasn't the Islamic Revolution that changed the name from Persia to Iran. The name change happened in 1935 under the rule of the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, in recognition of and out of gratitude to Nazi Germany. That's already a bad start to the issue. It was done in April of 35, coinciding with the birthday of Adolf Hitler, since Iran means the land of the Aryans. That being said, because it's often claimed that it was the Islamic Revolution that changed the name, that's false. You can easily look up what I'm talking about online. The situation of women and society in general after the Islamic Revolution is very clear. During the Shah's time, they always show us those pictures of women in miniskirts. Well, this was the upper class of Iran at private parties or very specific people, wealthy, well-off classes of Iran, who dressed like that. Iranian society wasn't like that, especially not in rural areas. But beyond a picture of a girl in a miniskirt, I pay attention to the facts. The literacy data, the poverty data, the infant mortality data, the data on access to university for the population, all these figures improve remarkably. They undergo a dramatic transformation with the Islamic Revolution. Illiteracy today is practically negligible, only in very specific rural areas. Women have access to all possible professions. Infant mortality has been reduced to levels entirely comparable to those in the West. A whole series of social indicators, including the mortality rate itself. There are several indicators to compare a society with the West, and today they meet those standards despite difficult conditions like sanctions. People now often discuss the sanctions on Iran. But these sanctions have been in place since 1979. Despite an entirely unfavorable economic context, Iran has built a fully modern society. And the only thing they can point to using those photos you mentioned is the imposition of the hijab, a scarf that doesn't have to cover the hair, but simply has to cover the head. And in fact, for many decades now, at least a couple of decades, it has basically just ended up being a scarf around the neck. Anyone who has been to Iran and has access to social media, people who are not partisan, on this issue, I express a very strong sympathy for the Islamic Republic. But people who don't have these leanings, they have made documentaries, and we see how women dress in the big cities, in Tabriz, in Tehran, in Bandar Abbas, in any city. We see that women, for the most part, especially the young ones, there's a difference between young women and women of a certain age in the way they dress. It would be like what happened in the West during the 1960s. Women in Spain used to wear long skirts and followed a series of dress codes, while young women wore miniskirts and had different styles of clothing. Something similar is happening in Iran, and of course, for some years now, the ban on not wearing the hijab has been lifted. Now it's completely free. Anyone who has been to Tehran or these cities, these big cities, to Isfahan, to Mashhad, has seen hundreds of thousands of women without these imposed dress codes. That is to say, there is no objective argument left to say that women are oppressed, that the Islamic Revolution has taken Iran back to the Middle Ages, as we can sometimes read in some media. None of this is true. And this can be demonstrated by all those people who go to Iran, who document it, who show it, and who tell us things that are entirely different from those narratives. The Islamic Revolution has brought enormous progress to Iran compared with the situation under the Shah. And I invite people to look at the data. It's not an opinion, it's a statement of fact.
I want to ask you the question. Why are there so many forces trying to convince Westerners to justify an invasion, a massacre? Also, Iran has close to 100 million inhabitants, and this goes against our own interests. Since this conflict doesn't help us, and I think this is objective. Look at the gas prices. Anyone who says, no, what about the women? Analyze it. For the average Spaniard, that's the only thing I care about. Spain comes first. I don't care if Iran is treated badly. I don't care what happens in Uzbekistan. I only care about what happens here. This harms us. And I'm not saying this as an opinion. I'm saying it as a fact. Why is there such a strong campaign, going back to the original question, to convince us that it's a good thing for us to get involved in these conflicts?
There are global pressure groups, I'm talking about Zionism, that decide international policies. We're seeing it with Trump. Trump certainly didn't want to enter this war, and neither did the United States. It has been dragged in by the power of those Zionist pressure groups, in this case from Israel. But I'm not the only one saying this. Just 3 days ago, the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, who is hardly suspected of being pro-Iranian, for example, said the same thing. And Germany's top official has said it, and the Parliament of Sweden has said it. There are many forces in Europe that see that on the one hand, there is no possible justification, legal, moral, or of any kind for this attack. And then the consequences that could result from the Israeli and American aggression against Iran. Obviously, economic issues. We're talking about this war, not only the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which accounts for about 20 to 25% of hydrocarbon traffic. But you would also have to add the closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, that strait that connects the Indian Ocean with the Red Sea, and therefore access to the Suez Canal. We're talking about all the Gulf countries potentially getting involved, which they already are, but to a much greater extent. If Iran were to attack the oil production of the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, this would paralyze the world. We wouldn't just be discussing Brent crude exceeding 100 or 200 euros per barrel anymore. We would be talking about an amount of money that would triple the prices of consumer goods in the West. Even if it were just for that reason, how sad it is that we have to cling to the economic issue and set aside, overlook the humanitarian issue, the issue of justice, the issue of truth, as we said at the beginning. But even if it were just for economic reasons, it makes no sense to justify an attack that will drive up prices in Europe like we've probably never seen before. But there's also another backdrop. Also, those who have attacked Iran are allies of Morocco, which is an enemy of Spain and is unjustifiably claiming, more than claiming, I would say they want to steal from us, some territories that have always been Spanish. They have been Spanish even before the constitution of the country itself, the Kingdom of Morocco, so they can't claim something that was never theirs. But be that as it may, the United States and Israel support Morocco militarily and diplomatically in the situation regarding the claim over Ceuta, Melilla, and the Canary Islands. Given this, it makes no sense that European governments, and especially ours, Spain, which is the one that matters to us because above all is Spain, would act otherwise. How can we justify attacking a nation that is the enemy of those who want to take a piece of our territory from us? There is no justification for it. It's utter nonsense. And you ask, why does this happen? Because of the pressure from those Zionist groups. Zionism openly controls American politics. Already within the United States, not only in the Democratic Party, but also in the Republican Party, within that indefinable amalgam that was MAGA, and even within Donald Trump's inner circle, there are already many voices. The person responsible for counterterrorism has resigned, precisely because of this issue. There have been high-ranking American military officials who have resigned or have been dismissed because they said this war makes no sense and goes against the interests of the American people themselves. This is the situation, but those pressure groups are so powerful that, of course, the United States and Donald Trump, regardless of the reason, since I don't want to get into that or speculate on the situation. We're all thinking about the Epstein Island issue and these kinds of things. But whether it's this or other issues, the reality is that these Israeli pressure groups have dragged the United States and Donald Trump logically, and they want to drag many actors in the region and even Europe itself. The move has backfired. France and the United Kingdom initially supported an attack on Iran because they believed the Zionist propaganda itself, which said that this war would be over in 48 hours. When they saw that this wasn't the case, France itself, which had sent the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, withdrew it. The United Kingdom did the same. Europe stands to lose much and gain nothing in this conflict.
It's very important for people to understand this within Islam. I'm going to change the subject since we've already discussed this with Ruben. I want people to understand a little bit that Islam is not homogeneous. Iran is a Shia theocracy, that's true.
It's a country with a Shia majority where Shiism is part of politics. A theocracy, I don't like the word, but it's undoubtedly a confessional country.
All right. What are the differences between a Shia theocracy or confessional government and a Sunni one? Where are women or homosexuals more likely to suffer consequences or punishments, whether physical or legal, for sexual misconduct and so on? In Saudi Arabia or in Iran?
The simple answer is Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, there is such a strict religious imposition that not only is Christianity banned. I know for a fact that religious authorities have banned the Bible. To bring the Bible there, what they do is send loose pages of the Bible in certain ways, and then they are assembled secretly because it could lead to death. Physical punishments include hudud penalties. None of this happens in Iran. In Iran, the Bible is published. There are Christians, and Christians are constitutionally represented. There are 5 seats reserved for religious minorities in the Iranian constitution, and this is actually implemented so that one is reserved for Jews, another is reserved for Zoroastrians, and 3 for Christians. They are not Catholics, most of them are Armenians, there are some Anglicans, and of course Chaldeans. These 3 seats are reserved for those 3 minorities. Christians are not persecuted or anything like that. And corporal punishment hasn't existed in Iran for 40 years either. Quite the opposite of what exists in many countries, in several Sunni majority countries, including the one you mentioned, Saudi Arabia. Jews, but here the point is that the narratives against Iran come from what I explained before, the nationalization of resources. Saudi Arabia is a partner of Europe, and therefore everything that happens in Saudi Arabia will be buried, will be hidden, and won't be given any kind of attention.
Saudi Arabia does have its resources exploited by the West.
Yes. And at this point, I would like to mention something, which is that all Islamism, the part of Islam we know as political Islam, which has given rise to all those terrorist groups, all of Islamism, whether it's the terrorist groups themselves or those who support those terrorist groups, like in the case of Saudi Arabia, when it comes to economic matters, they are radically free market. That is the explanation for replacing Bashar al-Assad with al-Sarraj now in Syria. That is the explanation. All Islamism that is funded, aided, supported, and justified by the West is radically free market economically and always, absolutely always, favors the entry of foreign or Western entities or corporations for the exploitation of resources. Shiism does not accept this, and that's why it has nationalized it. Saudi Arabia, of course. Since the very beginning, since the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by the Saud family, it's a country where the royal family's surname gives its name to the nation. Look, it's not even a theocracy anymore. It's basically a private estate. From the very beginning, England and the United States allowed the Saud family to establish Saudi Arabia with one condition, that oil payments would be made in dollars. That's one of the cornerstones for maintaining the existence of the dollar.
Let's dive a bit deeper so everyone can understand. Here, it's not just about preserving Israel's interests, but I also understand that it's about preserving the dollar as the currency for oil trading.
Of course, since 1944 with Bretton Woods and a bit later, it was established that oil payments had to be made in dollars. And this has been the case until the emergence, well, it's still the case in 99.9% of situations, but since the existence of the BRICS, it has been proposed that things shouldn't be this way. A currency was considered, and it was also proposed that each country pay in its own local currency instead of in dollars, which is now starting to happen. And Iran, which is an associate member of BRICS, accepted this measure. Along with that, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, China, of course, Malaysia are behind this. Saudi Arabia toyed with the idea, was called out and suffered a reprimand from the West because that's the cornerstone of the dollar support, that oil has to be paid for in dollars. All these countries, China, Africa, Iran, Russia, who have questioned this issue. You're asking if, in the end, if the outcome of the war were the destruction of Iran's state structures, would this be imposed with more force? Of course it would. One of the consequences that this war could bring, this war is going to bring many consequences. One might be perhaps that the nations that have supported and continue to support the Islamic Republic will position themselves with much greater confidence and strength. In the payment for oil in local currencies, not only in yuan, but each one paying in their own currency, is a consequence that when I talk about the West, I mean the United States and Israel, they cannot tolerate. Perhaps the nations that have supported the Islamic Republic will act with confidence and strength.
Here, this is not just a territorial issue. It's not a matter of People have the perception that this has to end with the destruction of the Ayatollahs because they oppress women. That's the level of the average person. So, what I would like, Carlos, is a clear and concise message to these people so they understand that this goes much further.
Because all those things they've told us about democracy, about human rights, about homosexuals, about women are distortions. Many times based on real events, but magnified and distorted. Women do not face any kind of oppression in Iran. When I say no kind of oppression, I mean no kind of oppression. There is nothing that justifies us saying that women are oppressed. The background is something else. All of those are decoys, justifications, so that the public, with those narratives, justifies and accepts this attack. We have seen videos of well-known people. I was thinking the day before yesterday about a video by Ndongo, whom I know personally. I used to work with him on a TV show. I have nothing against him, quite the opposite. I consider him more than just a colleague from the media. He has no idea. He has absorbed all these narratives without any kind of filter. He believes that women are oppressed, that homosexuals are hanged from cranes, that is a theocracy, things like that. And he made a video, I use him as an example, because he made a video 2 days ago where he said he's willing to pay more for things as long as the regime of the Ayatollahs is overthrown. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what an Ayatollah is, he doesn't know what Iran is, he doesn't know what the Islamic Revolution is, or what Shiism is, but it doesn't matter. The power of the media has made ordinary people see Iran as the ultimate example of evil, and therefore all the struggle and the consequences that come from that struggle to overthrow Islam, Shiism, and the structures of the Iranian state will be justifiable. How can you tell people a clear message that this is not what they're fighting for? They're fighting so that the United States and the West, on one hand, can get in and profit from those resources. Because behind that is the construction of Greater Israel, that Israel faces no restraint in the region. And therefore, as has been said these days, it could annex a third of Lebanon, annex the West Bank, go even further, since it already has several territories in Syria, and actually reach Damascus. Behind this are two issues that could cause more problems. We'd have to address Turkey and its response if this occurred. I don't think it will, since Iran won't fall. The real reason is creating Greater Israel and exploiting resources. Let's stop discussing women, homosexuals, or democracy, since that's not the issue.
Why? I want to ask you a question. I'm going to take the position of the person, as you said, Hambatran. Why is it bad for that Greater Israel to be created when Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East? It's the only place where the rights of homosexuals are respected. It's the only place where women can vote, enlist. That's the rhetoric. I want you to justify to me why it would be bad if Iran fell. Why would it be bad if Greater Israel was finally formed? Because Judeo-Christian values must prevail.
That would be for extra credit later.
It's ironic, isn't it? Everyone who knows me knows that I don't. Well,
let me start by saying that Israel is not the only democracy in the region. All the countries that have historically surrounded it, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, have been democracies. They have had parliaments, political parties, elections, constitutions, and so on. I seriously question whether Israel is a democracy. And the establishment of that Greater Israel, I start from the premise that Israel is an illegitimate, illegal country that has used terrorism, and that it has no reason to exist. Since 1948, when it was established, it has been illegality embodied in a state. It has 17 United Nations directives against it, urging them to stop stealing water, practicing segregation, committing genocide, and things like that. The expansion of that small area that is Israel, the Zionist entity, into a much larger sphere will mean the expansion of all these things it has done since 1948. Right now in Lebanon, which isn't being talked about much because the situation in Iran is overshadowing it, genocide is being committed. 700,000 people have been displaced. The number of dead, I don't know if it's already more than 2,000 or 3,000, and Christians are being attacked within the territory of Israel today. When we talked about the Christians in Iran, there hasn't been any statement from any church, neither Armenian, nor evangelical, nor Chaldean. No non-Orthodox church has issued a statement about the situation of Christians in Iran, but there are several statements from various Eastern patriarchs about the situation of Christians. Christians would be swept away from that greater Israel, just as they are being swept away from Lebanon, from Palestine, and from Israeli soil itself. So the creation of a much larger space would be the development of these policies in a much bigger area. When we talk about Greater Israel, we're talking about from the Euphrates to the Nile, which is their pipe dream. We're talking about half of Iraq, all of Syria, all of Lebanon, all of Palestine, all of Jordan, a piece of Saudi Arabia, and a piece of Egypt. It would be a monumental absurdity. But also, if that weren't enough, it would be the end of the Middle East. The Middle East is something else. If I've fallen in love with the Middle East, it's because it has some very clear and fundamental characteristics. And all of this would end because Israel is a mono-religious state, it's an ethno-religious state. It would also mean the end of the Middle East. And eliminating the Middle East would mean annihilating or expelling everyone who isn't Jewish, including Christians. Judeo-Christianity, since you brought it up, let me say ironically, we have to say that Judeo-Christianity has never existed. Judeo-Christianity is a term from the 19th century that was coined in Central Europe to make it easier for the Zionist movement to pursue its aims with Christian support. We are 2,000 years late to this discussion because this question was already debated by St. Peter and St. Paul, whether Christianity was a fulfillment of Judaism or something else that had nothing to do with it. St. Peter defended the Judaizing position. St. Paul, who was of Greek cultural origin, argued that it was something entirely new and that we were breaking away from Judaism. St. Peter and St. Paul even came to blows. They were not gentlemen from a Cambridge club, but actually came to blows, and St. Paul's thesis prevailed. Therefore, to all those who talk about Judeo-Christianity, I recommend that they read St. Paul, that they read the letters to all the churches, to the Corinthians, to Ephesus, to Thessalonica. Christianity's message separates from Judaism. The idea of Judeo-Christianity is a 19th century invention pushed for others' benefit, which I won't accept.
Carlos, I want to ask you a question about Islam because nowadays our focus is very scattered. Nowadays, many people believe that Islam is the enemy of the West. And so that rhetoric is also used to justify what we do in the Middle East because they say that if we take down Iran, we take down terrorism, as if Iran were the one financing terrorism. Is Islam the enemy of the West?
Islam has not been the enemy of the West. It has been in some phases of history. We remember the huge expansion of Islam in the 8th century that affected us. The entire Iberian Peninsula fell under Islam. The Balkans, territories, the island of Sicily, Cyprus, European territories fell under Islam. The course of history was as we all know. Today, Islam is not the enemy of Europe. The enemy of Europe is actually the one who makes us believe that Islam is the enemy. There are Muslim majority countries that are our enemies. Earlier I was talking about Morocco. We haven't talked about Turkey, about how it has flooded us with non-European people amid the war in Syria, opening and closing the gates of immigration, just like Morocco does, by the way. So there are Muslim majority countries that are indeed enemies of Europe or Spain. But Islam as a concept? No. Earlier you said, and you said it very well, that a mistake is to see Islam as something monolithic, as a still image, as something solid, and that it doesn't have, well, interpretations or countries where its cultural background wouldn't be entirely different. This is what, on many occasions, I talk about these issues, about how the cultural background prevails over religion, in such a way that they create enormously diverse societies, to the point that there are countries with a Muslim majority that are not enemies of Europe or Spain that have coexisted with Christianity. I'm talking about Lebanon, historical Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Iran itself, and other countries that have indeed imposed cultural categories that make it possible to use Islam as a threat, undoubtedly. Within Islam, there are Quranic schools. There are 4 in the Sunni world. There is a Quranic school specific to Shiism that have produced entirely different forms, to the point that there are Islamic forms that are fully compatible with the West. For example, that Shiism will never be an enemy of Europe. Europe has had times when it had a very strong, good neighborly relationship with Islam. From here, I recommend looking at the relationship that Charlemagne, who was hardly suspicious in this matter, had with the Sultan of Palestine, or St. Francis with the Sultan of Egypt, with the leader of the Fatimid army at that time. There are many forms of Islam, and this is a very important message. They could be allies of Europe. Europe's strong partners and allies. Not so with others, regardless of whether they are Muslim or not. The case of Morocco will always be a key test case and an enemy of Spain for many other reasons. And it has been like this. That's how it has been throughout history. So saying that Islam is the enemy is an idea that underlies those narratives, which is promoted because of that. Those big Zionist lobbies that try to make us see it that way. Among other things, to make the systematic attack on that part of the world seem justified. There is an Orientalism within the West that tells us that part of the world is savage, that Islam is violent. Well, those parts of the world, Iran and Western Asia, historic Syria, are cradles of human civilization. That should be remembered first. And regarding terrorism, jihadist terrorism, as it's called here, a word that doesn't actually exist, it's a Western neologism, has been a Western creation. The Taliban are a Western creation. Al-Qaeda is a Western creation. Tahrir al-Sham was and is a Western creation. The Islamic State was a Western creation. And in the case of Iran, Iran is a country that suffers from terrorism. Not only does it not promote it, but it has suffered terrorism on its own soil with those Iranian People's Mujahideen who have had collusion with political parties in our country here in Spain.
Which one?
Well, El País published it so that neither you nor I get any online or legal repercussions. A founder of the Vox Party had a very close relationship with the leader of the Iranian People's Mujahideen, which is a terrorist group responsible for over 1,000 deaths in Iran, who are banned in all Middle Eastern countries. Huh? And not only that, in the Syrian war, I was in the Syrian war and I spent quite a lot of time there. I witnessed Hezbollah's conquest of Arsal in Lebanon from the Islamic State. I've been in Iraq.
Hezbollah and the Islamic State?
They had conflicts. Yes, of course.
It's just that Hezbollah is considered a terrorist organization.
In the United States and Israel. In Europe, Hezbollah's military wing is considered terrorist. The party itself is not. Hezbollah is a... But let's close the other topic. Iran fought against terrorism in the Syrian war. General Qasem Soleimani, assassinated and acknowledged by Donald Trump, was a key architect of the fight against terrorism in the Middle East. He defended Christians and eliminated the Islamic State from almost all of Iraq. The one who has fought against and suffers from terrorism is Iran. The one who funds and pays for terrorism is the West. Regarding intentions, I anticipated this question earlier because I expected it might come up, since Islamism in all its forms is always ultra-liberal when it comes to economic matters. During the Syrian war, there was an effort to destroy the state structures of Bashar al-Assad's Ba'athist Syria.
All right. When you talk about Islamism, you draw a clear distinction between, yes.
Islam is the religion.
What are those two differences?
Islam is the religion that all of us in one way or another to some extent know about. We know it exists. And Islamism is an interpretation that comes from a very specific Sunni school, which is the Hanbali school. There are 4 schools.
Salafists, right? Wahhabists.
Salafism. There are also misunderstandings about this issue. One thing is Salafism. Salafism would be a return to the origins, to the founders. All religions have had that, especially the monotheistic ones. The Franciscans, in a way, were a return to the origins of Christianity, to the poverty of Christ, and that kind of thing. Salafism is a return to the origins, to living as Muhammad taught in Islam. That in itself doesn't imply any problem, nor is it anything harmful. What happens is that the interpretation of Islam, of the Quranic text, in a literal, decontextualized, and strict way, led to the creation of its own school within Islam, which is the Hanbali school. This school later gave rise to an interpretation by Wahhab in the 18th century, which led to what we know today as Wahhabism, which comes from that root. And that would be one of the branches of Islamism, the imposition of a decontextualized, strict, literal Islam. Along with this, an interpretation of Islam promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood, which emerged in Egypt in the 1920s, also spread. which has the same purpose as Wahhabism, the imposition of a very specific, strict, and decontextualized Islam. The difference between Wahhabism and the Muslim Brotherhood is that Wahhabism systematically uses violence. Wahhabism is what gives rise to all those terrorist groups I mentioned earlier, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and so on. And the Muslim Brotherhood accepts the democratic process. The Muslim Brotherhood aims to implement a very strict and specific version of Sharia. It uses the democratic process, creates charitable institutions, and forms political parties. These are the political parties that exist in Europe and in Spain. There are parties of the Muslim Brotherhood that accept the democratic process and try to gain power. But if, when the time comes, they see that they can't gain power through democracy, they use violence. Exactly the same. In Syria, they tried it twice. In Lebanon, on some occasions. They are banned in Russia, in Iran, of course, and now even in Syria, because what exists in Syria is something even more serious than the Muslim Brotherhood. And that is Islamism, political Islam. In any book on Islamic studies, it's called political Islam. It's the decontextualized and strict interpretation of that reading of the Quran. They also describe themselves as religious politicians, and they put politics before religion. That's why it's called political Islam. They want to impose things that Islam, in principle, does not seek to impose.
Returning to the topic of Hezbollah, because that was something I had to ask about. I mean, it's a lie. It had conflicts with the Islamic State itself, just like Iran.
Of course.
In Syria, I mean, that whole area was in constant war against the Islamic State. And how did the Islamic State come about? Who gave them weapons? Who trained them? Because of course, when you think about it calmly, you wonder, how is it possible that these people managed to militarize themselves like this? That takes a lot of money, a lot of resources. How did the Islamic State form?
Well, on one hand, having already made the distinction between Islam and Islamism, it's Islamism that goes against Islam. Here, people always talk about jihadism and say that Islamism was created to attack the West. Islamism wants to impose that decontextualized vision of Islam. And the main enemies are the Muslims themselves who do not accept their biased, strict, and literal vision. Because of this, that's why I said earlier that Iran has suffered from Islamism and terrorism. And Hezbollah fought against that Islamism. General Qasem Soleimani and all the Shiite forces, of course. And not only Shiites, but also those from the axis of resistance. There was also Assad Syria, which was not Shiite.
And other groups. Were they Sunnis in Assad Syria?
Yes, Bashar al-Assad's Syria was non-denominational, but it was certainly a secular country where there was absolute religious plurality. Christianity was fully accepted. The president of the parliament, when I was there, was Christian. Christians were part of Syrian society, but not anymore thanks to the West and that Islamism. And that whole axis of resistance fights against Islamism because they see that form of Islamism as heresy. If someone is Muslim, they have to see that form of Islamism as heresy. Who founded that Islamic State form of Islamism? It was the United States, Great Britain, France, Israel, and Turkey. Basically, they are the ones who shaped that monster that was the Islamic State. Let's remember the videos they made, beheading Christians, submerging people in cages in boiling oil, putting a grenade in their mouths, that kind of thing. It was thanks to the West, which wanted to destroy Syria's state structures. The Syrian war is very complex, but all the interests of the West, the East, from top to bottom, from Turkey to France, including the United Kingdom, Israel, all of them, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, of course, came together to destroy Syria and create something else that could benefit the big corporations, to extract its resources. That is the Islamism of the Islamic State. What governs Syria today is in some way a distorted form of the Islamic State. It was the West's desire for that part of the world.
And right now there is a former member of Al-Qaeda, a former high-ranking commander of Al-Qaeda there, and he has handed over all of Syria's resources to the West, and that's why the West says nothing, and now we remain silent.
Exactly, that's the explanation.
And the deception we're facing, Carlos?
Well, the level of deception is absolute. Let's remember, in the war in Syria, people said
that Bashar al-Assad was attacking his own people, though it wasn't mentioned he was fighting the Islamic State.
He was fighting against the Islamic State. The ones who were fighting against the Islamic State and were his allies, and I saw it with my own eyes, were Hezbollah. Iran and Russia played a very prominent role in the first part of the war to fight against the Islamic State.
The Russians put a lot on the line
In the last chapter, they backed off and paved the way for what happened, but I go there in the years 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, up until 2024. That's how Russian support was. And it was the United States that I saw not only funded the Islamism of the Islamic State, but they were also in sync to attack the Syrian Arab army forces. I saw how the anti-terrorist, anti-jihadist coalition carried out bombings. And the Islamic State, in perfect sync, was attacking the positions of the Syrian Arab army. I saw this myself. Everyone in the Middle East knew this, even the baker on the corner. I recall talking to a baker in Damascus who gave an insightful lesson in geopolitics. This is what existed. And in that context, that's when I saw, during the capture of certain towns, Hezbollah fighting against the Islamic State and putting their dead on the line. Hezbollah has made a stand. This might be heresy in front of the brainwashed masses who will be watching us, many of them. But Hezbollah has put many of their dead on the line so that jihadism doesn't come to Europe. Hezbollah has defended us.
What is Hezbollah? Because many people might just be thinking of Lebanon here. Lebanon is another country that is playing a role, as you said very well, in this whole conflict. And from what people here understand, many people, many evangelicals who believe that the chosen people of God have rights to the land, this is going to sound very sad to them. It won't resonate with what they believe. The rhetoric is that Israel has the right to exist and that Israel is fighting for Europe. It is the shield of the West. That's the rhetoric. I'm trying to destroy it, but it's costing me since I'm making many enemies. I recently posted a story and lost several followers.
Today you'll lose more.
I don't think so, because we're conducting a serious analysis and ultimately the truth has only one path. And if that means having personal financial losses, then let it be God's will. I'll go to my grave at peace, knowing that at least I fought for the truth to prevail. How does Israel interact? How does it get along with its main neighbors? West Bank, Syria, Lebanon. And let's talk about Hezbollah.
Israel has always had a problem with its neighbors. It's true that the Zionists will say they have been attacked. Well, from the very first moment since Israel was established in May of 48, the next day, the Arab nation, as it was called, then attacked and lost the subsequent wars. Egypt was finally pacified in 79 with the Camp David Accords. They had to remove Nasser, who was discussed like other regional politicians. Back then, what is now said about Iran was also said about Nasser. With Syria, since 1973, since the October War, the Yom Kippur War as it's known here, they maintained they still hadn't signed peace. Bashar al-Assad's Syria never signed peace with Israel. And then there's the issue of Lebanon. Each country would have its own problems, although all the problems stem from the illegal and illegitimate existence of Israel. Since we're going to focus on Lebanon, Lebanon had a war. Lebanon was the Switzerland of the Middle East. Lebanon was a country, Beirut was the Paris of the Middle East, of course. Some Beirut neighborhoods still remind us through their architecture of what the city used to be like. Today, sadly, after the war and many other things, they are building in the style of the Persian Gulf, with horrible glass buildings and that sort of thing. But the Armenian neighborhood remains, and some areas of Beirut still remind us of what it used to be. There was a war from 75 to 90 in which Israel was involved, reaching as far as Beirut. And in the heat of this war, in 1982, Hezbollah was created. Hezbollah was created by Iran. Under Iran's direction, a movement was created out of earlier groups such as the Lebanese Shia Amal Party. People still think that most of Lebanon's population is Christian, Maronite, who follow the Eastern Rite but are under the authority of Rome, but that's not the case anymore. Shia have been Lebanon's largest minority for a long time, likely since the 1980s. All of this Shia minority forms a political bloc between Amal and Hezbollah. Hezbollah is basically a political party that has its own militias. And some might ask, why does a political party have militias? And in Europe, that's what gets called terrorist. The political parties of of Lebanon at that time had militias. The Maronite Syrian Social Nationalist Party had its own militias. Several militias in this regard. The Kataib had the Lebanese Phalanges, they had their military wing, and Hezbollah did as well. What happens is that after this war ended in 1990, peace was agreed upon in the Saudi Arabian city of Taif. and Hezbollah did not accept demilitarization. They did not accept demilitarization because they knew that future Israeli attacks on Lebanon would occur. And they created a political party, militias, and a welfare arm. Not many people know the true value that Hezbollah has in terms of welfare. Not just hospitals or for the most disadvantaged, but they also have blood banks. They have a network of supermarkets because they have territory where they give jobs to Lebanese people and sell those agricultural surpluses in Hezbollah's own supermarkets. During the coronavirus, they did welfare work that even the Lebanese state itself couldn't carry out. That's why people say that Hezbollah is a state within a state. Many times, Hezbollah's own armed forces are stronger than the Lebanese army itself. I have seen Beirut Airport, Rafid Hariri, where the security and protection of the airport are handled by Hezbollah forces. This is the context. But the truth is that it was formed in 82, and in 85 they made their manifesto, which is the manifesto to the dispossessed of Lebanon and the world, where they describe themselves as a Shia force. Hezbollah wants a Shia confessional state against Lebanon's multi-religious backdrop, but they hide it from us. In 2005 and 2006, they made a second manifesto where they renounced all of that, and that earned them enormous sympathy from the Lebanese population. First, because they had already defended them in 2006 in the 33-day war against Israel. But in addition, they abandoned their Shia confessionalism to become a national party. And many Christians join Hezbollah, and I have seen in the city of Lebanon where there is a monument to the Virgin at 3,040 meters that protects it. Hezbollah, I have seen around the Syrian border how Hezbollah was rebuilding churches. I have seen how there are Christian people who are part of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has transcended. Starting from that supposed Shia background and from creating a confessional Lebanon to becoming a national party that understands that Christians are part of Lebanon. Many Christians live in the south where most people are Shia, but there are still many Christians there. Even up to ABK, up to Bakbel, they gather around Hezbollah, and this is what is hidden from us. And we are told that Hezbollah is the same as the Islamic State, and we are told that Hezbollah is a terrorist group. Hezbollah is a resistance group against Israel. Hezbollah would never attack any other country. Carlos, we've discussed several concepts,
often repeated, like Shiism and Sunnism. Could you, as an expert in Islam, make a clear distinction between the two, both in their origins and today?
It has a historical origin when Muhammad died in 632, and the question arose, who will succeed Muhammad? Up to this point, everything is logical, and there are two interpretations. Some believe that Muhammad's successor must come from among the believers of the Ummah. And those will be the Sunnis because they follow the Sunnah, the tradition. But there is a small group that believes, for reasons that are not relevant here, that he expressly told Ali that the successor of Muhammad must come from the family of the Prophet, from the al-Bayt. The followers of that belief are the Shiites because they are known as the Shiat Ali, the followers of Ali. This is the historical origin. It should be mentioned that the Sunni side prevailed with Abu Bakr, and then there would be two more successors. They were very old people. Abu Bakr must have been around 80 years old. At that time, the successors Uthman and Omar also succeeded him. And the fourth caliph would be Ali, but Ali was assassinated. No solamente esto, and the one who was from the family of the Prophet was the son-in-law and cousin of Muhammad. So being from the family of the Prophet, he was assassinated. And not only will this cause a commotion within Islam, but it would also explain that division. But later on, a few years after, his son Hussein would rise up against injustice and against lies. De los Omeyas. In Karbala, in a city in Iraq with just over 30 followers facing an army of thousands, he was logically going to die, knowing he was going to his death to defend the memory of Ali, to stand against the injustices committed by the Umayyads. He dies at that moment, and that's when a split occurs, although neither side will ever acknowledge it, because Islam cannot recognize any kind of split. is that when in fact the difference between Shiism and Sunnism is established. Those followers of Ali and Hussein, they are going to create the first Quranic school, the Jafari school. Later, the other Sunni interpretations would come, and they are going to create their own theological corpus. In this way, they create a proto-religious hierarchy. Why? Because they understand that while the Sunnis simply appeal to the reading of the Quran and let each person draw their own conclusions, the Shiites believe that there must be someone to lead the community and explain the message of Islam to them.
Something similar to what the Catholic Church is in Christianity or the Orthodox Church.
Algo parecido. That's where the Ayatollahs come in. This is for Ndongo and anyone unfamiliar with what an Ayatollah is. He is the one who interprets, he holds the highest rank within Shiism, and he interprets the message of Islam. This, in fact, causes a huge rupture, a schism, if you will, would be more accurate to say. And also, they will be able to explain any phenomenon. As for the believer situation, Sunnism remains tied to the interpretations that had been made up to that point. I mention this because, for example, with Iran, it's important since everything is viewed from when the Islamic Republic was founded. They question whether caviar is haram or halal, whether it's allowed to eat it or not, whether cinemas are allowed, and what about nuclear energy, and then Iran and Shiism. He concluded that nuclear energy cannot be developed for military purposes, and Khomeini said so. And Khamenei issued a fatwa about this in 2004, which completely dismissed the nuclear threat from Iran.
But the whole nuclear threat claim gets applied to any nation that is an enemy of Israel. Just a week away from the nuclear bomb.
Of course, and they have produced two entirely different societies, and that's why in Shiism, the Shiite countries, it is estimated that there is no census about it. But it is estimated that around 20% of the Islamic world, 45 nations, 1.5 billion people, well, about 20% of those are Shiites. They are a majority in Iran, of course, as well as in Bahrain, Azerbaijan, Yemen, Iraq today, and Lebanon today. Then, there are other important communities in the south of Saudi Arabia itself, in other countries, but simply those countries are the ones with a Shiite majority. Shiites make up about 20% and they are a part of Islam. Yes, it could be that I take this opportunity to pick up the thread of the conversation. That could be an ally of the West, because in the end we see that when traveling to Shiite countries, that the message and practice of Shiite theology is very similar to the Catholic world, very different from the practice in Saudi Arabia, very different from sub-Saharan Africa, very different from Southeast Asia. They have given rise to an entirely unique form of Islam that is comparable to the West, backed by a millennia-old cultural tradition. Let's not forget that Iran has 3,000 years of Islam, and that cultural background I mentioned at the beginning has shaped this Shiite Islam, giving it a Shiite form, and not only Shiite, but also a Persian form of Shiism. If you allow me the expression, it is different from the Shiism we can see in other parts of the world. For example, just as a curiosity, in Lebanon, Shiite women wear t-shirts and miniskirts, but this doesn't happen in Persian culture because they don't have that tradition of wearing this type of clothing. Or is it very different from the Shiism that can be found in Yemen? Completely different, because those cultural backgrounds have definitely shaped, even more than religion, the customs and traditions of each country.
And what about Sunnism? What are its distinguishing features? Because we focused a lot on Shiism, and I want to talk a little more about Sunnism.
It has 4 schools of thought. We've already talked about one of those schools before, the Hanbali school, which develops mainly in Saudi Arabia and in some other areas of the Middle East, gives rise to what we know as jihadism. Then there has been a great Maliki school in Africa that gives a rather gentle form of Islam. An even gentler form is Shafi Islam in Southeast Asia, and they have theologically produced an Islam that allows each person, through reading the Quran, to adhere to that historical Islam preached by Muhammad. After his death, they have not evolved, while Shia Islam has evolved. For me, This is perhaps the great difference between Sunnism and Shiism, that Shia Islam has been explaining the advances of history while Sunnism has not. But above all, and regardless of the schools we have, I insist the cultural backgrounds, and so Islam in a country where it has not had cultural backgrounds. I'm talking, for example, about sub-Saharan Africa, where female genital mutilation is practiced. Those issues we see with child marriages, a series of things, the clothing, the burqa. In Afghanistan, a series of elements that were pre-Islamic cultural practices have continued, but they are attributed to Islam. All those additions are used against Islam, but they are not Islamic. Rather, they have prevailed from an earlier period before the arrival of Islam. And Islam, in those cultural contexts, has allowed it. And this must be clearly distinguished because otherwise we will end up confused. To believe that the burqa is Islamic, that female genital mutilation is Islamic, that child marriage is Islamic, and none of that exists in Islam. Rather, there are majority Muslim countries with a null or non-existent cultural background.
So, why do you claim that Shiism has the potential to be a great ally of the West, but you don't make the same claim about Sunnism?
Well, first, for geographical reasons, geopolitically, we are never going to have a war with Iran. We've never had one because of the distance. Our interests and our problems are entirely distant, and we are not going to have any. And all the countries I have pointed out where Shiism is present. We are not going to have problems with Azerbaijan. They are very far away, and we are not going to have problems with them. But, secondly, from a theological point of view, their beliefs and practices are not so different from Catholicism. Look at Ashura, the main Shiite festival, where they even perform rituals in remembrance of Hussein's death in Karbala. They have processions. Anyone who hears me will criticize what I'm about to say, but it's true. They have Holy Week-style processional floats. They have, just like we do during Holy Week, moments of penance that are very similar. Our worldview with Shiism is similar when it comes to the end times. For them, there has to be a return. After Hussein, there continued to be caliphs, and the 12th one went into hiding. He disappeared. And they await the coming of that caliph who is the Mahdi, who will come together with Jesus Christ to establish paradise on earth. Their defense of the figure of the Virgin Mary, their defense of Jesus himself, that without recognizing obviously his divine nature, they do acknowledge a series of things that even Sunnism itself does not recognize. And with that, I'm also talking about Hezbollah, about Ansarullah in Yemen, about Iran. Of course, they have an entire worldview very similar to the Catholic world, and even the practice of that. That religious expression takes shape in ways that remind us of Catholicism in Spain in the 1940s or 1950s. For example, life in Spain in the 1940s or 1950s is not very different from life in present-day Iran. There are elements, undoubtedly, that differentiate them, such as not consuming alcohol or any other particularity. But the worldview of traditional Spain, of the Catholic world, and the current Shia world is very similar.
I want to ask you a question. Do you think Islamic immigration or immigration by people who profess Islam is compatible with an increasingly secular West? Increasingly less focused on identity, increasingly distant from spirituality?
There are two reasons Islam triggers this kind of backlash. One is history. Spain was formed by fighting against Islam, and this makes us wary whenever we see Islam. And the second is immigration, which you mentioned. Spain has been hit by immigration all of a sudden, the kind of immigration we have now. A large part of it comes from cultural backgrounds with a Muslim majority. In this regard, most are Moroccan, then Algerian, then Senegalese, and then from Bangladesh. They are very small cultural backgrounds that cause quite obvious problems. I'm not the one linking immigration with crime, it's the statistics themselves that do it. There are figures about it, and also a type of crime that we haven't seen here before. We weren't familiar with gang rapes, nor were we familiar with the criminal phenomenon that's happening these days. This causes rejection and problems among the native population, who recognize that Islam is to blame. But I think this is where the mistake lies. Obviously, immigration is a problem that needs to be tackled head on. If we don't, we'll go down the drain of history, just like what's happening to France and Belgium. It's a problem, and if we ignore it, we can't do anything. It also has many internal issues. And one of the problems comes from some people who come from those Islamic backgrounds who want to impose a series of customs and practices, many of which are not truly Islamic. On one hand, those burqas, those genital mutilations that are happening in some cases. On the other hand, purely Islamic customs. Spain has nothing to do with Islam. It was established against Islam. So introducing Islamic elements is a huge distortion. On the other hand, we see, or many people see, that groups from these populations who are not devout religious Muslims, but quite the opposite. We're getting the worst from each place, often from here, always. On this topic, I recommend following Ruben Pulido. He knows the issue perfectly and explains it to us very well. And what kind of people? Are we getting the best each place has to offer, or what their own countries don't want? Notable figures from the Islamic world have been warning us for a long time that we're getting the worst each place has to offer. Not to mention how Morocco behaves in this regard. Morocco has often gone as far as opening prisons and sending people to us, in that case, human contingents. We haven't received engineers, they're musicians. People from the prison population come here, and they cause a series of problems for the people. Starting from the premise that I think it's pretty stupid, the foolishness reaches a level where it just can't be sustained anymore. And people are seeing it in the neighborhoods, in the big cities. Madrid, not to mention Barcelona. Barcelona is already unbelievable. Bilbao started a long time ago. Almeria. There are rural areas, let's not forget rural Spain, that are having problems with these issues in Murcia and Almeria, in small areas. There have already been some clashes in this regard because people are coming to us. But I don't even like to talk only about Islamic immigration. We don't talk about Christian evangelical immigration when people come from Latin America. Adding the religious aspect, I think, already distorts the issue. In summary, if we were to receive, like we did in the 70s, large groups from Syria and Lebanon who today are already retired, but they were excellent doctors, people with a high cultural status, there was no problem at all. The problem arises when people come from backgrounds with little or no cultural foundation, as is the case with Morocco, which has never had an important cultural background. This is used by people to tell us that it's Islam, but Islam is not the problem. It's people, waves of people coming to us from cultural backgrounds where it doesn't exist. There was a case in Seville where a man killed and raped, I don't know in what order, a woman, and the police caught him eating her hand. Let me remind you that cannibalism still exists in the world. And what if we accept people coming to us with cannibal backgrounds, without culture, from places where they're used to killing with a machete like this for €3? And these kinds of things, the problem is going to explode. And this doesn't only apply to countries with a Muslim majority. People come from Hispanic America, whose cultural background is very similar.
Do you believe in Hispanic identity?
Hispanic identity? It was a wonderful event. The discovery, conquest, and evangelization of America was a unique, unrepeatable, and admirable event in history. The way we left there was unfortunate, and admitting that some people from the Bolivian highlands are the same as those from Soria, I'm against that. I respect history. To make us swallow something unbelievable and say that all of Hispanic America fits into Spain, first of all, for a physical reason. You can't fit 30 people in a phone booth. The younger ones might not even know what a phone booth is. But they don't fit in my house. You can't fit 500 people in Spain. You can't fit 500 million people. That's to start with, and within what's called Hispanidad, from the Strait of Magellan to Tierra del Fuego, there's enormous diversity. It's not static either. Islam isn't static, and neither is this. From Tijuana to Tierra del Fuego, it's not. There are backgrounds in Hispanic America that are fully comparable and others that aren't.
I agree. I'm a faithful Hispanist, but for me, a Hispanist is someone who has that Hispanic culture, that Catholic culture, that Christian culture, and obviously has left other things behind.
Let me ask a question. A person who is of another race, whose name is Wilson, who is Protestant and eats Tucuman empanadas. Can you explain to me what I have in common with him? I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so you're on that side of saying no, right? But it's true that at the end of the day, I do defend that I have more in common with a Wilson, that I have more in common with a Moja.
Well, I have felt at home. I felt at home in Lebanon. I haven't been to Hispanic America,
You've never been.
but maybe in the highlands I would have a nervous breakdown
Why?
because I couldn't stand many things that might be there. For example, well, then in the end I would be shocked. If you want, we can cut that. No, no, no. Everyone who speaks Spanish is Hispanic. So there are many people from the Ilerdense Pyrenees who don't speak Spanish. There are people from Gipuzkoa who don't speak Spanish. And to me, they are Spanish. So language is not the key.
No, it's a combination.
In the Philippines, nobody speaks Spanish anymore. They're no longer part of the Hispanic world. I think that theory about language as the unifying element of Hispanic identity, I think it breaks down, it falls apart in many ways.
It's likely that we need to analyze more deeply what is and what isn't in Buenos Aires.
Of course, I feel at home.
You mentioned Protestantism earlier. Do you think that Protestantism has been positive or negative for Christianity as a whole?
It was the rupture, it was the end of Europe. It used to be called Christendom before it was called the West and started worshipping other things. Luther, that poor man, I think Luther didn't see what was coming after him. Luther, whom even the Catholic Church itself has recognized recently. The rupture, the reform that Luther wanted to make, which later led to the Counter-Reformation, that's one thing. But what came after that is another. It was entirely disastrous, a rupture in every sense. Luther recognizes the value of the Eucharist. He had a very famous discussion, Luther with Zwingli, for example, who denied transubstantiation, the transformation of bread into the body of Christ and wine into blood. And this is not just a theological rupture that might interest only a few, but it became something else. And I'll explain later what came after Calvin and what followed, with all that mix of fanatics who call themselves Christians, who to me are not, of heretical sects from the United States, which then leads to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and entirely delusional things which led to a very specific mentality. They are the fathers of capitalism, for example. The Protestant split encouraged capitalism. It encouraged a certain way of being. Earlier on the way here, I was telling you that maybe I feel more comfortable in Lebanon than in Stockholm. Well, yes, because the way people are in Lebanon is very similar. It's the Mediterranean and we share many things, with or without Islam, and in Stockholm it's something else, which comes as a result of that split brought about by Luther and all those who followed him who were worse than Luther. It was the end of Christendom. It was what led to internal religious wars in Europe. It was used to justify the Church of England. It was used to justify the end of Catholicism in part of Europe. Very specifically from the middle of France to the north then, with those small islands of Catholics like Poland or other places, things like that. Protestantism was the first great defeat of Christianity in history. It was the origin of many ills, and I include capitalism among them. For the world, it was the justification for the policies of England and the United States, which they later carried out with that colonization. Were you asking me about Spain? Look at the colonization that Spain carried out, commendable in many aspects, and the real barbarity that the British brought to the world in their English or American forms. Luther's split was the first nail in Europe's coffin.
Why do you consider capitalism as something disastrous or something negative? Because if you analyze the data, since the world became capitalist, the world has become less and less poor. That is, from 100 years ago until now, poverty has been progressively decreasing. These are facts. There's a more philosophical background, What do you base that statement on? And look, this is coming from a guy who is becoming less and less capitalist. I mean, I've been evolving. I don't affiliate myself with any particular idea, but I do want to ask you, what's behind that statement?
First, there's a Sadducean trap from the outset. Of course, I live better than Julius Caesar. But not because of capitalism, but because time has passed and there have been some advances. Material advances on one hand, all kinds of advances, and the richest man in antiquity lives worse than I do. It's not like I live very well, but you know what I mean? And nobody, of course. Time goes by, and I have better clothes than Emperor Cyrus, and I can travel by plane to Timbuktu, and he couldn't. So as time goes by, people start living better to begin with. Second, capitalism. Whether capitalism has actually made humanity progress in the end is debatable. Humanity advanced a lot, so capitalism isn't necessary for progress. Third, there's a factor that I think is very important, which is that this economic system we know as capitalism ignores certain human issues. Now, the big bosses of capitalism laugh at social justice. I can't accept any system, any economic idea that ignores helping the weak, whether it's philosophical, religious, or of any kind. It leaves millions of people out in the cold. Is the highest expression of capitalism the United States, or has it always been that way? Now they'll tell me it's Singapore or some Asian dragon, or some fool like Pereira or people like that will come out telling me about these things. But it's always been the United States, and the United States has created some terrible pockets of poverty. Mother Teresa of Calcutta traveling to the United States, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. For the younger ones as well, let me remind you that she was a woman who dedicated herself to being with the poor, the poorest of the poor, with those who had the least. The poor of India, with the lepers, with the outcasts, with those who were about to die. Well, she was horrified by the pockets of poverty that existed in the United States, and she said so publicly. That is to say, capitalism produces wealth that becomes concentrated in the hands of particular people, sometimes fewer and fewer of them. That phenomenon is occurring, which is a Marxist view, though I am not a Marxist. Let me make that clear, but it's a reality, and it's leaving and excluding millions and millions and millions of people. So many times people say, well, now there are fewer poor people than 80 years ago. From a Marxist perspective, having more would be unbelievable. As time goes by, logically, that wealth, which grows substantially over time, also reaches those who are the most disadvantaged in the world. But here in Spain, this phenomenon is also happening. I understand that we live in a capitalist system. Yeah, someone might tell me, after having 7 carajillos, that we live in a social communist regime, but let them sleep it off and then we can talk about it. And the economic differences are getting bigger and bigger, much greater than when there was a mixed system, if you will, like the one that might have existed when I was a child, where that human side of the economy wasn't ignored, which explained why you could pay off a house in 5 or 7 years, not like today, where it's every man for himself. I'm talking about Franco because I was born under Franco. I'm sorry. If I had been born under Ashurbanipal, I would talk about Ashurbanipal. But of course, the economic policy that existed under Franco's regime in its last years, because I was born at the very end. And what still came from that was much more humane than what we have today. And it created the middle class, which no longer exists today. And it allowed a government employee with a very normal salary to support 7 people. It wasn't like we spent the whole month of August in a villa on a private cove in Ibiza, because we didn't have a family town to go back to and we didn't make a lot of money. Not at all. And I saw this, and we all went to college, all 5 or 4 siblings, but my older sister couldn't go. Anyway, there was a sense of unity, and the third in command of the regime lived right next door. I lived on Virgen del Puerto Street, which is a completely normal street next to the river, right next door. The regime's third in command lived there since the president lived in his own home, not a palace. That is a regime that pays attention, that has a market, a regime with a market, not a market regime. A regime where the market exists, but that addresses the necessary social responses. That's the system I believe in, not in capitalism, which is every man for himself.
I understand perfectly. I want to ask you a couple of short questions. What do you think is the biggest historical lie that has been sold to us as true?
There are many historical lies.
List them for me in order from the biggest ones.
Nero comes to mind, for example, who was actually a good ruler. They've portrayed him playing the liar while Rome burns and things like that. No, poor man. Richard the Lionheart, who was a real scoundrel. And they've shown Robin Hood movies like The Great Tal. You see, right? Going through history, we find this in all sorts of things. The 20th century is the time when propaganda and mass media are used to deceive on a massive scale, and then big lies appear. Throughout this 20th century, look at what's happening with our civil war and Franco's own regime. Now there's a reinterpretation, and the media are being used to tell us things that those of us who lived through it know are lies. But there are very few of us left, and I think there's no one left who lived through the war. So can they tell us whatever they want? World War II has probably been the topic that has been lied about the most. It's the topic that has had the most garbage dumped on it, the most intentional distortion, and the world has been living off the lies of World War II to justify the world that came after. Perhaps it's the subject people have lied about the most.
I wanted to talk to you about that and connect it with Iran. You mentioned earlier that Iran was named that way out of sympathy for Hitler, land of the Aryans. I want you to elaborate a bit on that story. And what role did Nazi Germany play in the Middle East?
All right. Germany has enjoyed a great deal of sympathy in the Middle East. Current Germany or Nazi Germany? Germany as a state? Look, for example, in Damascus, there's the tomb of Saladin.
And Saladin, the one who fought the war with King Baldwin. I mean, Saladin,
against whom
reconquered Jerusalem from the Templars
and expelled the Christians. Acre was the last Christian city in the Near East since the Crusades, which, by the way, the Crusades are another lie in history. History, not because they didn't exist or anything like that, but the Crusades. They weren't to recover the holy places, but rather to put an end to the Eastern churches. Surely, but Salah ad-Din, well, the great hero who was Kurdish and unified a large part of that Islamic world, expelled the Christians. He is a hero throughout the Near East. The mausoleum, Salah ad-Din's sarcophagus, Emperor Wilhelm gifted it, made it out of marble, and that's how it was displayed. I'm not sure if al-Sara destroyed it, but that's how it was, and you could see it. I've been there. Germany always had very strong sympathies in the area. It already goes back to the Kaiser.
Wilhelm of Germany, he's the one before von Bismarck.
Post is after the German unification. Wilhelm II is the one who donated it.
I like history and understand some, but I don't have it all connected.
But it had a huge connection, always. In the Middle East, he's the one who builds or helps build a railway network in Iraq, for example. This is basically explained by the fact that the whole area was under British influence or control. Iraq was, in one way or another, until World War I, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt itself, in a different way, under a mandate, were under British power. As always, Germany has been an enemy of Great Britain. So there was great sympathy, hoping for the liberation of this whole part of the world during World War II. The Axis, both Italy in North Africa and Germany in the Middle East, well, I don't think there was a single country. There wasn't a single country in the Middle East where there weren't demonstrations in favor of the Axis, and some tried to rise up. There were movements in all the countries. I'm remembering from Oman to Turkey, it was something tremendous. In the case of Iran, there wasn't a direct relationship, but now we're getting into thorny issues, like how National Socialism stirred up enormous sympathies. Hitler was on the cover of the biggest American magazine of the time in the 1930s, 33, 34, 35, up to 36. Up until the Berlin Olympics, sympathies for Adolf Hitler spread throughout the world. And in the Middle East as well, in that context, that's when in 1935 the name that used to be Persia was changed. World War II stories rarely mention the Middle East, though battles occurred there. Syria rose up under the French mandate. It rose up. There were wars in Lebanon, and Iraq also rose up. Germany even sent something, but what did Germany send? Keep in mind that we're talking about the year 41. In June is when the offensive against the Soviet Union begins. Operation Barbarossa is on June 22, 1941. The plan is around that time. I think he sent 4 or 5 planes to Iraq. Germany could help, but if there was, for example, an Arab Legion, there were volunteers. Just think that Germany formed the largest volunteer army outside the Reich. In the Waffen-SS, they ended up having 1 million volunteers. Part of those volunteers, a proportional part, came from the Islamic world. There were many from Bosnia, some from Iraq, and even from India, units within the Waffen-SS. Dressed in their own attire, there were very few of them, but they wore their turbans. Those from North Africa wore their fez with their own poi.
They enlisted to fight against British colonialism.
Against the English and French oppression in that part of the Middle East. They hoped that with the Axis victory they would become independent. It couldn't happen. Germany lost and it wasn't possible.
Okay. Look, I didn't know that part of the story at all.
That's what I'm here for.
Okay. Worldwide, what's the biggest lie about World War II that we've been sold? Because nowadays, you start analyzing the lies they tell you about things you're seeing in 4K, you're watching it in high definition on camera, and they tell you, no, there's no genocide happening in Gaza. And you think, how is there not a genocide happening in Gaza? I mean, I'm not the typical leftist pro-Palestinian who's been brainwashed and goes out to protest. I analyze the circumstances, and based on what I see, I make a decision. My judgment is what tells me if something is right or wrong. Nowadays, they deny to me that there's an attempt to ethnically cleanse Gaza. They deny it to me, and I'm seeing it. There are videos of Israeli soldiers killing children, playing as snipers. I mean, what we're seeing in 4K is pretty disturbing. Anyone with eyes can see it. This isn't a matter of left or right. This is a matter of humanity. How can I know they're not lying about what happened 80 years ago?
We've been lied to about what happened 80 years ago. To begin with, I don't know, there must be a lot of lies within that chapter we've known as the Second World War, from 39 to 45. I'm thinking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Was it real? Of course, on December 7th, Japan bombed, but what they don't tell you is that Japan was under sanctions, completely surrounded. They were provoked, and the United States had withdrawn their aircraft carriers before the attack, and what was bombed was just scrap they had there. They lied about it. It has been hidden from us that during World War II, England committed genocide in India, killing 7 million people.
7
million people, and in Iran just as many. Both were ordered by Churchill, and today Churchill has a statue outside Parliament in London, a completely nefarious person. If ever there was one, many things are hidden from us and others are distorted for us. Perhaps one of the conclusions, one of the consequences of these lies that would later be used as justification for the existence of Israel is the Jewish genocide during World War II. Which is a lie. I mean, the idea that it is justified is a lie. It's a lie that the existence of Israel is justified by the genocide because the idea of Israel is much older. It goes back to the 1920s. So even if there hadn't been a Second World War, Israel would have been established in the same way. But also the way, the manner, the forms, and all the details they've given us about the Holocaust are questionable, are deeply questionable. But it would reinforce the narrative that the Jews needed a place to go, the attempts to place the Jews somewhere in the world, that there were many places that were considered, it would have happened regardless of the Holocaust and the very existence of the Second World War, but to create the idea that the Holocaust was carried out. Those 6 million Jews murdered in gas chambers on an industrial scale, right? Well, they would justify and reinforce the narratives that would lead to the existence of Israel. About this historical fact, well, it has been distorted. Many Israeli historians have lied, right? Illiterates call into question the existence of the Holocaust in the way it has been explained to us.
For example, because I want to investigate it.
Refer you to Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry, for example, about how
Finkelstein is
Rabbi Finkelstein,
right? Totally anti-Zionist. He's anti-Zionist.
I don't know if he's a rabbi. I think if he is a rabbi, it's worse for him. But why worse for him? He'll know, I don't know, I'm not Jewish. The point is that many authors, Ilan Pape, a great Israeli author, Jewish anti-Zionist, right? And others. Many question whether the Holocaust happened that way and deeply criticize the political gains drawn from the Holocaust to justify the existence of Israel. This is a reality.
You know, look, do you know what really blows my mind? That when someone wants to question any event in history, if someone wants to question whether there was a Christian reconquest here, or wants to question, I don't know, the civil war from both sides. No, there's only the narrative of historical memory. Everything is questionable, everything can be reviewed. But when it comes to this topic specifically, be careful, okay? Because there are prison sentences.
Of course.
That's what makes me suspicious, and that's what makes me want to know more. Hey, and on top of that, I've also done some research, and there were actually quite a lot of Jews committed to the truth who have said, hey, this doesn't add up for me.
There are things that definitely don't add up.
For example,
Well, the figure of 6 million, for example. Today, referring to statistics from before World War II, the numbers don't add up between those supposed 6 million and the people who later left Europe. There are circumstances, but the main issue at this point is precisely that. All of history, because it is part of science. History is a part of science and it can be revised. It wouldn't be acceptable for them to tell us that no more research in physics is allowed, that this is unchangeable. Well, let's see if Newton's principles and these kinds of things still hold true. History is, by definition, open to revision, shaping our current view of historical truth. Earlier I said that Nero, well, maybe something will come up that proves that Nero was obviously indeed a horrible dictator who killed a lot of people, and he enjoyed it. But until today, what is known about Nero is that he regretted the first one. He regretted it, he said. He wished he had never learned to write when he signed the first death sentence, for example. Well, history can be revised, research must continue. But when it comes to World War II, specifically the Holocaust, these things are not open to revision, and here in Europe it's forbidden. Even questioning it in Spain is not a crime. I'm sorry, not believing it or questioning it. There was a time with interference, with the imposition of the 1995 code, but that was changed. What is a crime in Spain is to justify, boast about, laugh at, or do something like that. Of a Holocaust, they've even imposed that word of a genocide, but not denying it or not investigating it. And here in Europe, the investigation of this specific historical event, which is known as the Holocaust, has been prohibited. This is what is not acceptable. Any historical event can be investigated, and the moment a historical event, Columbus arrived on October 12, 1492, at the island of Guarani. And that's just how it is. If you want to investigate and say that he arrived in Cyprus with a bottle of brandy, then prove it. But don't forbid me from saying something silly. Silly things can be refuted. You say something silly and I refute it, with documents and data, but forbidding us from talking about a specific historical event already makes us suspect other things.
and besides, I think there's a contemporary genocide. There are many genocides, but this one is much worse. And it's the genocide perpetrated by the Bolsheviks, by the Bolshevik leadership.
For example,
In the gulags, and above all against Christian people.
several genocides have been committed against Christians throughout history, and nobody has cared, or they haven't been given that kind of attention. There haven't been movies made about them. Nobody makes a fuss, day in, day out. You mentioned that genocide, but we could also discuss the Armenian genocide by the Turks or other genocides that are barely known.
Armenians too.
Yes, Christians and Armenians, of course. Armenia was the first Christian nation with its own liturgy and autocephalous church, creating its own unique Christianity. They are Christians. I know movies have been made, but no one in the West knows about them. The Saipho genocide, which was against Christians, Chaldeans, and Armenians, and Syriac Orthodox, was carried out by the Turks and by Kurdish Islamists. Well, people don't talk about those things because they don't want to know, because it's not interesting, because there's nothing to gain from it, because people don't like to talk about it. Because in the end, we will find out. Earlier, I mentioned 7 million in Iran and another 7 million.
That is documented.
The genocide committed by the United States in the Philippines is well documented. But no one is interested in knowing any of that. And in the end, we will come to a sad conclusion that the lives of some people are worth more than others.
That's our conclusion today.
Sadly, that's the case, because 7 million Iranians should be worth the same as 7 million people of any other ethnicity. But it seems that's not the case.
I want to ask you a question. Where does the power of the narrative come from? Why do they control the narrative so much? Why are there so many movies talking about what the chosen people suffered during World War II? And yet, little is said about how the Bolsheviks destroyed Christian Russia. Why is it that everyone knows about World War II? Everyone has that burned into their minds, but not what happened in Armenia. Why? Where does that narrative power come from? Where does that ability to control the world and the minds that inhabit it come from?
For me, there are two explanations. One, because there is a rather obvious hatred of Christianity. We constantly talk about jihadism, but we don't talk about the anti-Christian policies that are being developed. On European soil, for example, there is a rather clear hatred of Christianity. And on the other hand, the specific fact you're asking me about is that the media, audiovisual media, and cinema has been in the hands of people who are interested in spreading that idea to justify the existence of Israel, to continue receiving payments today in terms of compensation from Germany, for example, as reparation for that genocide. It's in their interest to keep mentioning it and have people talk about it constantly. People who don't know a thing about anything. They know about the existence of the Jewish Holocaust, but they don't know about our genocides. They don't even know about Cantinflas. Surely, it doesn't matter what we talk about. They don't know anything about anything.
Understood, Carlos. I have one last question for you. The creation of Israel. Earlier, you stated that the creation of Israel was inevitable regardless of World War II. Do you think Israel would still have been created if the Axis had won? Careful, huh?
Yes, but not in Israel. Israel wouldn't have come to be. Was there a connection? Someone will come here making comments, pretending to be intellectual about the relationship between the Third Reich and the Zionist movements. They were real, but were they meant to relocate them to another area?
Madagascar, right?
The Madagascar Plan?
The Havara Agreement too, as I understand. Yes.
Yes, even in Palestine it had some connection, but it would never have been established in Palestine, not because of the prevailing support of that Arab Legion, the relationship that Adolf Hitler had with the Mufti of Jerusalem, a series of things that would not have made it possible to establish it in Palestine. The state of Israel as we know it would have been somewhere else in the world. There have been Jewish republics within the Soviet Union in East Asia, north of Mongolia, a very suitable place. This has existed, but not relocating people 2,000 years later to a place that does not belong to them. Just imagine if someone, some visionary, wanted to rebuild the Roman Empire. Well, that's something similar to what these people are supposedly demanding. Because with arguments as solid as saying that God promised it to them, well,
it's absolutely mind-blowing for a Christian person, obviously, who believes. Since obviously they believe that God promised them that land, what would you say to convince them of the harm caused in that region and in the world in general by the creation of Israel? Well,
we've come back several times to a very interesting point, which is that there are people who connect the biblical Israel with the current Israel. To those people, it should be said that the current Israel is not the biblical Israel. Making that connection is complete nonsense, a delusion. And that's what we're witnessing today in Israel, telling those people that one thing is biblical Israel, the people of Israel, everything we know from the Old Testament. And another thing is the Zionist creation of an ethnocentric colonialist idea. And with everything that has resulted from it, then there's the Zionist entity, the State of Israel, which has nothing to do with it. And here we're not just talking about Jews and so on. We're talking about evangelicals. We're talking about those people who talk about Judeo-Christianity. I'm talking about all the people who, without any discernment, associate the biblical Israel with the current Israel. It has nothing to do with it. In fact, many Jews, a lot of them, are against what we now know as Israel. According to the Jewish religion, the Constitution of Israel is itself blasphemous as long as the Messiah has not yet arrived. But Zionism, which has nothing religious about it, which later used religion or other religions to do whatever it wanted, was the Constitution. of an ethnocentric state that would be the aircraft carrier of the West in that part of the world, the existence of Israel can only bring misfortune. With this, I'll finish. I'm told you solve it. I don't have the solution for the Middle East, God help me, but I do know one thing. Palestine may disappear. It's about to. Assad's Syria may disappear. Many things have disappeared, but the problem remains. Peace will only come to the Middle East when Israel disappears.
Thank you. What solution do we give to its inhabitants?
Let them go back to where they came from because they came from Poland, from the United States, from Russia, from Hungary. Let them go back to their homes or let them stay if they want, but it can't be called Israel.
This conflict is very difficult to solve, very difficult. How do you think this story ends? Your personal opinion, this story, Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, how is this resolved? What's the ending of the story? Because as a Christian, I believe these are biblical times. I think this goes beyond the material, this goes beyond geopolitics. For me, this is already a more metaphysical issue.
On one hand, there's the issue of the Middle East. It's set up so that they'll be in this situation for centuries. It was designed to be this way. I've already said that until Israel disappears, there won't be peace in the region. The chapter of Iran is just one part of this whole story. I think Iran will hold on. Iran will come out victorious. There will be a future war not too long from now between Israel and Turkey most likely, and we'll always be talking about wars, about stories, about things. Now, the question of the end times, which is what you're talking about, I think you interviewed someone privately who says they know the date of the end times. Well, let's just remember one thing. When Jesus was asked, when will it come? When will that be? He said that only my Father knows. Jesus Christ himself didn't know. I'm not going to be more than Jesus Christ, nor am I going to try to interpret it. Scholars have studied this subject for 2,000 years without reaching a conclusion. Yet some people casually discuss the end times over coffee.
People who will tell you the date? Me, well, I don't know. It's just that I have a perspective on this. In a way, there are several things written in the apocalypse that are happening now. Obviously, it could be that there are 100 or 200 years left.
It will be when we least expect it. It says to be alert because it will come like a thief in the night. We won't know. When we think it's going to happen, that's when it won't happen. That's the point of the matter then.
But just to be clear, do you think Israel will also prevail? I mean, Iran will win the war, but Israel will still exist?
Sadly, yes. I wish it were the end of Israel. And then that would be one of the solutions for that part of the world, along with the redrawing of some borders and other circumstances. But no, Israel will continue to exist, Iran will continue to exist, and we will still be talking about this even after 100 years.
Well, thank you very much for coming, Carlos.
For being here. People can't see it, but it's beautiful.
So thank you so much for coming. It's an extremely controversial show. Buru has to beep out certain words, my friend. And I hope people enjoy it. And above all, I hope people listen to it with an open mind. Here we interview all kinds of people. And on the 14th, I'm sitting down with a rabbi. I want you to know I'm going to sit down with a rabbi because he wrote me a message saying that I'm a good person. He didn't write me a message with any kind of bad intentions. I truly have to admit it, and I want you to know that I'm willing to talk with him because I want to know his perspective on things. I want to tell him why I think the way I do, and obviously, these kinds of conversations bring me more problems than solutions. But as I was saying, my commitment is to the truth, and unfortunately, I can't hide it. I can't avoid talking about this, and I can't be a coward and look the other way because reality is what it is and it imposes itself. Thank you so much, Carlos. Is there anything you want to say to the audience before we finish?
It's been a pleasure being with you. And really, I hope people do their own research, that they check the sources. Many of the things I've said, obviously, and they're right not to agree. But they should look into it, dig deeper into these issues, and not just swallow the narratives that come out on the news and those kinds of things. You have to read. You need to travel and research. By traveling, reading, and investigating, you'll develop your own perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. And that's all for today. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you in the next episode of LA Factoria.